good afternoon, and welcome to the session entitled The Future of Capitalism and Global Welfare of the second day of the 2022 Annual ESPAS Conference. My name is Dimitri Lorenzani. I'm an economist and a cabinet member of Maroš Šefčovič, European Commission Vice President for Interinstitutional Relations and Foresight, whom you might have heard yesterday morning in the opening political session of this conference. This afternoon, we are going to discuss about an extremely relevant issue for today's and tomorrow's societies in Europe and beyond. Are economic growth and capitalism the source of humanity's most pressing problems and concerns, like climate change in particular, or can they be part of the solution and thereby an engine of global welfare and well-being? Some say that we can and must enroll capitalism and the resources from the current growth and innovation model in the fight against climate change, climate catastrophe, and in the quest for well-being. Others find the promise of green capitalism as a shaky one and point to degrowth as the only way forward to acknowledge ecological limits and attain such inclusive and sustainable well-being. Now, this is a very poor summary of an extremely complex and open debate. But I think the important aspect is that strategic foresight will have a role in raising the attention to this debate that sometimes is a bit less underestimated. And we are thus extremely lucky today to be able to further disentangle this issue with very distinguished panelists and guests. And let me just allow me to thank and welcome them. We have with us today Beata Javorcik, Chief Economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Good afternoon, Beata.
Good afternoon.
Beata is an economist specialized in international trade, and I'm told she's a woman of records. She was actually the first woman to hold a statutory professorship in economics at the University of Oxford. She's the first woman to hold her current position, quite an important one, where she gets to advise the president of the EBRD on issues that are also very close to the heart of foresighters, like scenario building and risk management. Welcome also to Kate Raworth, Senior Visiting Research Associate of the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. Hi, Kate.
Hi, today I will be the woman of donuts.
Exactly. I was just saying that you are the famous author of the Donut Economics, a new economic model that tries to strike a balance between essential human needs and planetary boundaries. Welcome also to Timothée Parikh, researcher at the School of Economics and Management of the University of Lund in Sweden, and author, among others, of the book Ralentir ou Périr, l'économie de la décroissance. And here with me in the studio, Franck Desbiais, Associate Professor of Economic Geography and Geopolitics at the École Normale Supérieure and Director here at the European Parliamentary Research Service. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Just to explain a little bit how I intend to structure this session, I will first give the floor to Beata Javorcik for 10 minutes opening remarks. We will then start a panel discussion with 5 minutes reaction by each of the panelists, and I will then open the floor to your questions. So I just want to remind you to please ask your questions using Slido. You will have a QR code on your monitors for those who are attending the conference online. And of course, the more traditional way, raise your hands if you are here in the studio with us. But since the topic is very complex and rich, let's start without further ado with you, Professor Javorcik, dear Beata. We'd like to have your view on this ongoing debate, which also covers the role of the state, of the markets, and of civil society in driving a possible paradigm shift towards an economic model that respects planetary boundaries. Do we really need the resources of an expanding market economy to address policy changes like climate change, like pervasive inequalities, or can we do also without capitalism? The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be joining you today. I'm not sure I have the answer to all the questions you pose, but let me set a stage for the discussion. I think it's fair to say that we have been observing an increased dissatisfaction with capitalism. And it has been driven by a combination of factors: growing inequality, structural changes happening in the economy that force workers to change jobs, occupations, or even sectors of employment. And the need to change jobs causes uncertainty, anxiety, and that's something people are not very well equipped to deal with. That's something people dislike. And then we also have growing dissatisfaction with capitalism due to the recognition that it has failed when it comes to delivering on the environmental front. Now, if I zoom in on growing inequality and those structural shifts, they both have been driven by technological progress and globalization. Technological progress led to automation of some jobs. Globalization led to wiping out labor-intensive manufacturing employment in advanced economies. And, a good example of a country that has been hit by these two trend is the United States, where often losing your jobs means losing your health insurance. Nobel Prize laureate Angus Deaton talks about death of despair. These are deaths due to alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and suicides, and they have been on the rise among white middle-aged males in the United States, and in particular males without university education. And this is the group that has been particularly affected by declining size of the manufacturing sector. And because manufacturing is geographically concentrated, that means that they often had little in terms of alternative employment opportunities. And because regions that fall into an economic downturn also see decline in housing prices, it was often very difficult for these people to sell their existing house and move somewhere else. Now, if during the last 2 decades, mortality among these white middle-aged males without higher education has been on the rise in the US, while in Europe, we actually have seen a decline in mortality in this demographic group. Now, Europe has cushioned the blows, the shocks of globalization and technological progress through its well-developed welfare state. But of course, even in Europe, we have seen an increase in inequality. And the place where you have seen a big increase is actually Eastern Europe. New EU member states started 1990 with a very compressive pay scale. This is the legacy of communism, where there was very little wage premium. Wages were artificially compressed. Transition to a market economy led to decompression of pay scales. And even though most of the people in many of the countries are better off in absolute terms, the fact that they are doing worse in relative terms has caused a lot of unhappiness. And a good reflection of the fact is the fact that a ruling party in one of the Central European countries that was a poster child for successful transition, this ruling party managed to convince people during election that transition has been a failure, and that's what got this party elected into power. So this deep dissatisfaction with relative changes in the social structure have been very much palpable in the region. Now, this dissatisfaction with capitalism has made people more supportive of state intervention. And if I may ask for my slides to be shown now, it is actually a little known fact that public support for democracy is much higher than public support for private ownership. On this slide, you see the results of World Values Survey, where asked people in more than 100 countries around the globe about whether it is important to live in a democracy. And in pretty much every country, 3/4 of people believed it is important to live in a democracy. Democracy is a good thing. However, when you ask people whether they are in favor of expansion of private ownership, the picture is much more mixed. The share of people who give an affirmative action ranges from about 1/3 in Spain, for instance, to about 3/4. Only Japan and the US stand out when it comes to support for private ownership. And if history is any guide, it suggests that we are likely to see greater support for state intervention in the economy. If I may ask for the next slide. What we've seen over the last 2 decades is growing support for expansion of public ownership in firms and in industry. Again, these are results of the World Values Survey, which show that currently in advanced economies, about 1/3 of the people positively view the state playing a greater and greater role in firms and in industry. What's also striking is that there is very little difference between people born in various years, so people of different cohorts. And moreover, you see that the support for state playing a big role in the economy has increased over the last 20 years. Now, if you zoom in at post-communist countries, these are the countries that saw this disillusionment with capitalism, there this support for greater role of the state is on average equal to 45%. So almost half of the people favor the state playing a greater role. It is also a big increase over the last 20 years in people's views. And what's interesting is that this increase in positive views of the state is not due to demography. It's not due to there being more older people rather than younger people. You can see that within cohorts, people have become more positively predisposed towards greater presence of the state in the economy. Now, academic research also shows that people who experienced recessions or epidemics during their youth, during their formative years of 18 to 25, tend to be more suspicious when it comes to free market. They tend to favor redistribution more, and they are more supportive of the role of the state playing a greater role in the economy. As we had a pandemic recently, as we had turbulent times economically, and more turbulent economic times are ahead of us this year, it is fair to say that we are going to see more and more people voting for increased intervention of the state in the economy. But of course, the state ownership comes with some downsides. And it's not just the usual argument about state-owned enterprises being less efficient or less innovative. What's actually more troubling is the poor governance of the state sector, particularly state-owned enterprises and state-owned banks. My colleagues at the EBRD analyzed in detail framework that guides state-owned entities in emerging markets, and the picture that emerged was not pretty. In vast majority of emerging economies, there is no legislation that would prevent state-owned enterprises getting financial advantage over private sector. So expansion of state may mean that the playing field will be tilted against the private sector. But actually, it gets even worse. What's particularly worrying to me is the fact that state-owned entities can be used to channel advertising revenue to media outlets that are friendly to governments, that they can be used to purchase media outlets to make them friendly to government, that state-owned banks are often used to pump credit before elections to influence electoral outcomes. So in other words, in countries with poor institutional governance, we can expect ruling elites using this state sector, this growing state sector, to stay in power. So where does it all leave us? There are more structural changes that are underway. fighting climate change requires big changes to the structure of our economy. And that means people moving jobs, people moving sectors, people switching firms. Digitalization that is taking place and that sped up during the pandemic also requires people to upskill, to change jobs. It makes some jobs obsolete, and it creates winners and losers. So I expect that public ownership and the support for the state playing a greater role of the economy is going to increase. And as the structural changes are creating more uncertainty about employment, about where the particular jobs that people hold today will be there tomorrow. And I think the challenge we are facing is balancing this positive side of state intervention with the potential downside that state ownership in the economy may bring. So let me stop here.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Beata, Professor Jaworczyk, for your wise words. I picked some aspects like dissatisfaction with capitalism, greater role of the state, distrust in the private sector, the importance of redistribution, and implications on democratic governance, but also on economic winners and losers. I think this gives us a very good base, as you said, to set the picture, and now turn for reactions to our panelists. And let me start with Professor Rayworth, with Kate. Kate, in 2022, actually, what Beata said reminded me of what you wrote, that new era in global accountability is opening up, where the undeniable responsibility of the world's richest nations for destroying the life support systems of our planet must now be turned into meaningful reparations for those worst affected. So my question for you is, how can we build this just economic system that allows us to thrive while preserving the planet, minimizing social disparities, and what are the toughest constraints in reforming our global economic system in this direction? Are you okay with the recipe identified by Beata? The floor is yours. I can't hear you, Kate, sorry.
I was waiting to be unmuted. Thank you very much. Real pleasure to join and to follow Beata, and I really enjoyed her contribution. So I find it very strange for myself to be on a panel that's about the future of capitalism and global welfare. And I immediately need to turn the title around, because I'm not here to help create a future for capitalism. I'm here to talk about the future of life thriving on this planet. So I want to start with the donut as one way of imagining this. We need to meet the needs of all people, the essential claims and rights of every person, and we need to do this within the means of our delicately balanced living planetary home. To me, this is the future that I want to debate and I want to represent. And then I want to ask, well, what role for capitalism? Can capitalism take us there or not? Does capitalism deserve to remain as part of a 21st century vision or not? So then, even to discuss capitalism, I want to unpack it, because I think of it as like a black box concept, that when we use it, we may be talking about different things. In fact, I very often ask people, what do you mean by capitalism? And they mean very, very different things. So in order for us to have a conversation where we know we're discussing it, I've actually got right here the black box of capitalism. I decided to make it. And inside this black box, I'm going to pull out 6 things that I hear regularly. People say, oh, this is what capitalism means to be, just to put these on the table. And they're going to chime a lot with many of the things Beata's mentioned. So first out is markets. People say, well, capitalism involves markets. Yes, it does. And of course, it tends to make markets very, very prominent. So markets first, right? The presumption of many capitalist thinking is market is going to be the first best solution. And if it doesn't work, we should turn to the public sector. And Beata began to reference this as a possibility. Of course, that people then say, well, there's the danger that the public sector gets it wrong. And I would argue markets equally easily can also get it wrong. So second, once we've got markets, now it's a question about the means of production. These are all beginning with M, by the way. So who owns the means of production? And this is crucial, as Karl Marx made very, very clear. It really matters who's providing the labor and merely being paid a wage, and who owns the means of production, who owns the factory or the intellectual property or the land or the housing. and taking a rent or a dividend, because there's a huge power relationship there. So that, I think, is key in capitalism, and there is that separation between the workers and the owners. And then thirdly comes the question of motivation. Often capitalism is based upon the assumption that the deep human motivation is self-interest and increasing wealth. And I really, really question whether that is how we're deeply motivated. But I believe the predominance of capitalist systems have told us this is who we are, have told us this is what's motivated us. And indeed, research by people like Robert Frank and others show that the more that economic students are told this is who humanity is, the more we become like this and more motivated we are. So we really need a new story of ourselves to escape the monoculture of capitalism. Now, what is it we're motivated? And here comes money. Money and financialization, so accumulating or gathering wealth and the ability to financialize. And of course, this is at the heart of what capitalism does. It turns it into capital, which is value that can be transformed into financial wealth. So money, but then crucially, more. The predominant pattern of capitalism is that there is a return. And Polanyi and others pointed out, it's about gain and return on capital. And it puts that value and the claim of the return on a financial ownership first. And in the brilliant book by Katerina Pistor, The Code of Capital, she shows us how legally our systems have been encoded to give capital and its return priority and endurance and transferability. So I think that's a really important point, and the focus on endless accumulation and therefore endless economic growth, which becomes a very important cornerstone of a capitalist economy, and I think is profoundly problematic if we want to live on a delicately balanced living planet. Last one, how does capital maintain itself, the maintenance of capitalism? And of course, it is through the accumulation of wealth in the hands of those who own the means of production that through, coming back to the points Beata was raising, through influencing political systems, not through democracy, one person, one vote, but one billionaire, one media outlet, one billionaire, one knighthood, one voice in parliaments. And actually, I want to comment that Beata was saying one risk of using public services is that or the rise of the state is that the elite can then, I think, how did you put it? That the elite can reproduce and protect their power in the political system. But of course, that is exactly what we get in a capitalist private market led, where the elite of accumulating private power, absolutely through purchasing media outlets, through influencing political parties, through disinformation online and on social media, reproduce their power and maintain their role. So I want to conclude with having laid out these ideas. I hope we can all play with them. I think at the heart of the problem of the design of the capital system is, I'm going to do it here, more. This design that drives for endless increase and endless economic growth. And I'm sitting in the UK. We're in European countries right now. We're living in some of the richest countries in the history of humanity. And yet our economists and politicians will tell us that the success even of these countries depends on yet more growth endlessly. It never comes to mature and grow up. And I think this is the great transformation that is required. How can our economies learn to mature and not depend upon endless increase? Because that is what drives them to financialize and turn the value of human and ecological life into financial gain. So we need to take that out of the system. And lastly, that very important question, if we put at the heart of our vision the donut and ask, how do we ensure food, health, travel, education, housing, energy for all? Let's come back to that question of, will it be through market provision or public services that this is going to be done in a way that ensures sufficiency for all, that is done in an ecologically effective way, that we can provide decent services that minimize our impact? And I just want to, as a final example, compare European health systems, predominantly publicly based, with the American health system, privately based, which not only is far more expensive and far more excluding, but has a much larger environmental footprint as well. So there's a very strong, equitable and ecological case for public services, public transport, a public energy system that provides sufficiency for all and brings us back within planetary boundaries. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Kate. Quite interesting, this idea of taking issues with capitalism and unpacking the black box of it. And let's see if Timothée Parrique gives us a hand in further unpacking it. Timothée, I mean, Kate has a quite strong view, but for a long time, the assumption has been that high-income nations are actually able to progressively green their growth, green their capitalism, which means that there is scope for raising GDP while reducing carbon emissions. Instead, you argue that there is no such thing as green growth, and you defend degrowth as the only possible way forward. So I'd like to ask you why. I mean, don't you agree, for instance, with what Alessio Terzi argues earlier this year in his book, that economic growth and technological innovation that is actually essential in the fight against global warming are two sides of the same coin? Floor is yours.
Well, I sure don't agree with this, and I'm going to tell you exactly why. I think there's no future for capitalism, but there's no future for any economic system that is based on productivism and extractivism. So what Kate has described as this kind of logic of more, of unlimitedness. And so I think here we can use an idea from Herman Daly, one of the founding father of ecological economics. And Herman Daly was talking with this scale of an economy. You don't have to care whether it's a capitalist, a socialist, a communist economy. Look at the scale of it. If the scale is too big compared to the carrying capacity of your ecosystems, your economy is going to sink. Like an overloaded boat, whether it's a capitalist boat or a socialist boat or whatever you want, if you're just going over the carrying capacity of your ecosystems, your economy is going to sink. And now when we look at high-income countries, they all have scale problems. We can show that very nicely with Kate Donut, with the ecological ceilings, so we see a lot of red. And so indeed, some people have said exactly, so you can see the red bits. And so some people tell us that, well, but some countries have managed to green their growth. But what they mean by that is that some countries, a handful, usually between 10 and 20, have managed to increase their GDP while slightly decreasing their greenhouse gas emission. This is only one small thing among an array of interactions an economy has with ecosystems. So this is far from being enough. And even if you look at these reductions, they are tiny, super tiny. So when we look at ecological ceilings, we see finite thresholds. So the goal is not only to reduce emissions by whatever 1% per year, the goal is to get back under a safe threshold, a safe planetary boundary. So far, all the empirical studies we have on decoupling, the 900 of them, all the experiences of all countries in the world that we've been observing, none of them has experienced a decoupling that could reconcile economic growth with sustainability as defined by the respective planetary boundaries. Even worse, so not only economic growth, but the mere stabilization of current levels of production and consumption in these countries would not allow them to be sustainable. So again, they have a scale problem, which is the way of saying that they are biophysically obese compared to the carrying capacities of the ecosystems. And so they need to engage into this big macroeconomic diet that some people call degrowth. So a reduction of production and consumption so that these economies can lend back under the planetary boundary and then can just remain, steady state economies, focusing on quality, focusing on well-being. One extra point about, of course, we live in a world with high rates of inequality, and Beata was really making that point. And in that fight, in trying to not generate, but in trying to make to create a possibility for the eradication of poverty in regions of the world where needs remain unmet, we will need consequent quantities of materials, of minerals, of water. We will need climate space for countries that need it the most. So now the question is, we have countries in the global north where rates of economic growth have been decoupled for decades with welfare. So you can keep pushing your GDP button. This is not solving unemployment. This is not eradicating poverty. This is not reducing inequality. This is not even funding quality public services. And this is not increasing your level of well-being. So you're doing that, and it does nothing but just makes you more and more biophysically obese, or if not, it hinders your ability to fast and safely reduce your ecological footprint. So an approach that I find more convincing is to engage degrowth in these high-income countries, which they can do in a way that not only accelerate their return under planetary boundaries, but also maintain well-being, because again, well-being is not a matter of just quantity of GDP. It's a matter of sharing, it's a matter of quality, it's a matter of institutions, it's a matter of the wealth of what you have in communities. It's a matter of just what you produce and what you feel about producing it. It's a matter of the quality of jobs. So all of these questions. And doing that could allow to just liberate a lot of resources to be used where they need to be used most urgently, which is not in countries like France, the US, or Germany, or Sweden, but in the global south, where these countries face increasing pressures to adapt to the adverse consequences of climate change, and where these comes on top of previous pressures, just get themselves to a situation where they can actually have a steady state economy. So for me, that's, and then I would connect to what Kate has said. The problem with capitalism and why it's a misfitted system to the task is that capitalism can do anything except making it seem smaller. It's just, it's in the word. Capitalism is about the accumulation of capital. Imagine a game of Monopoly, and the goal is to accumulate money points. It does that very well, but it does that at enormous cost. And it may have been fine at another time in history when you were trying to rebuild your economy after a war or something. And even that we can discuss, maybe socially, that's not the best way of going around it. But today, if the challenge is to shrink your ecological footprint, the capitalist institutions, the 6 ones Kate talked about, they are rather problem than solutions.
Thank you very much. Merci, Timothée. I think it's high time to turn to Franck Debier, because Franck, we have heard various positions on how to best push for this new economic model, but I think a common element is that trust in and confidence in capitalism seems to be quite shaken. And my question for you is thus, do you think it's possible that this paradigm shift might still happen, supposing that there is a demand for it, while saving the capitalist system? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have no box, but I will also try to unpack a little bit this word that capitalism. Do we really have one? And please, let's see the slide. Here I'm the librarian, so you will not be surprised that I bring a few books in addition to the one we had before. Next slide. So, of course, we had, among our preference, read The Donuts Economy, and we have heard a lot about it. What it shows is, of course, the social demand is not only growth, it's much more detailed, this social foundation, and that the ceiling, the ecological ceiling, is much more than just a kind of carbon fix and a level of carbon or gas emission. It's much more complex, both on one side. But when we look at the future of capitalism, usually, and this was the case of ESPAS in the past, our favorite reading is Piketty, or was Piketty in the past, and the famous U-curve of inequality. Basically, the story is that any economy, you start with the very rich having very much. And then as the society modernizes, you have more opportunity for entrepreneurs. Also the state has bigger resources to be redistributed. But at the end of the story, maybe encouraged by another policy mix, but also because the entrepreneurs are becoming rent seekers, and some are able to add to the revenue of labor the revenue of capital, you have, again, a return to concentration of income. And this was confirmed, for instance, with this historical model of the US. What we like about Piketty is also usually what is the medicine that comes with the diagnosis. Because the medicine that is advocated for is basically three things we like. A new turn in redistribution, so rethinking redistribution, re-increasing redistribution one way or another, including higher taxation, increasing education and the dissemination of progress. Think of digital skills in the society so that you have more entrepreneurs, more opportunity, and having public finance for infrastructure, which lower the cost of enterprise for many individuals that can rely on such infrastructure. Think of 5G, for instance. So we like Piketty, but there is much wider spectrum of work on capitalism, and I know I just have 3 minutes, so we kind of go through the shelf. Next slide. Of course, this is my selection. The first one is the one of my professor in Oxford, David Harvey, who made the point something like 30 years ago already, that there is one shift that came quite unnoticed by the non-Marxist in capitalism itself. The capitalist economy has found in the 90s, 80s, 90s, new solution and has changed from Fordist capitalism to a much more flexible kind of capitalism. And we will have 1 minute to describe what he means there. Then, of course, we have Shoshana Zuboff with surveillance capitalism that is saying we have to be very careful because this flexible capitalism is turning into something else with a new concentration, not only of capital, but also of data, knowledge, in the hand of the few, and for the service, in some case, of the authoritarian state. But we have worse. We have, and this is very useful in the post-colonial scholarship, a kind of warning that the former old imperialist economy or imperialist capitalism, the one described already by Lenin in 1960, l'impérialisme, stade suprême du capitalisme, this is still living. And this is still living among us in the West, in the North, to a certain extent. And then we know also that a derivation of it, and we were touching it a little bit, is of course what is called kleptocratic capitalism. So I just showed the next slide and focus on one part, the transition from Fordist capitalism to flexible capitalism and surveillance capitalism. The rest you can read because we don't have time. But basically, Fordist capitalism is the capitalism we are criticizing or we have the nostalgia. The good news is that it doesn't exist anymore. We had something else. But the bad news is that maybe something else is even worse. What was the Fordist capitalism was mass consumption, mass production, economies of scale that were able to be partly redistributed through the welfare and by companies through better salary, and the ideology of consumerism. What we were discussing as the kind of ideology of capitalism, the kind of greed for growth, was partly associated with this ideology of Fordist capitalism. But since the beginning of the 90s, we have something different. And this something different is called flexible capitalism, capture of cheap supply, market share. Commodity, and we have a flexible niche market, opportunist reallocation of capital. Basically, capital is always moving. A supply side state. State is helping on the supply side, and as an ideology, globalization, the ideology of better governance that was very present in the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century, and also communitarism. So globalism and communitarism as the two sides of the kind of the same promise. I stop here. This is available in literature, but pay attention to the worst kind of capitalism, the kleptocratic, that is illustrated not only in Russia, but with other models. Try to search a little bit what it's about. And the return, the potential trap of a return to imperialist capitalism.
Thank you. Thank you so much. No, I think actually I take it in a positive way, that capitalism can adapt itself in a way. It's something that can adapt and can evolve. So maybe there are some hopes for this capitalistic model. And just before we move to the question and answer session, I want to give a round of applause to our 4 speakers. So thank you very much for your very, very insightful views. Let me now turn to some questions from the audience. I ask you to please keep your answers extremely short and telegraphic. And I would like to start. I will use my moderator's privilege to ask a question of Professor Javorčík. Dear Beata, we have actually heard a lot about this new welfare-based economic model. So we'll try to unpack the concept of capitalism and take it aside. So if applied on a national or international scale, what are the implications of a degrowth donut transition on global alliance structures? Is there a future for international trade and cooperation, which is a topic that is very close to your heart? How do you see it?
Well, thank you. I actually think that capitalism is not doomed. And I actually believe that we don't necessarily need degrowth, and I believe in innovation, that innovation can actually help remove some of the constraints, or at least lessen some of the constraints we are facing when it comes to environmental limitations. But what is important is institutions. We need good institutions so that the capitalism functions well, whether it is institutions that limit abuse of state ownership, whether this is institutions that prevent corporations from lobbying. As Kate rightly pointed out, economic power gives you political power. And that's why we need very good competition laws so that companies cannot abuse their market power and translate it into political power. And good institutions can in turn deliver good regulation and incentives for innovation. So let me stop here.
Oh, thank you, Beata. Actually, this inspires me to ask another question of Kate Raworth. Kate, you highlighted these concepts of sufficiency, I would say also frugality in a way. What are the limits to this concept? Can we really master the public support that these concepts need for them to become pillars of this new donut model, of a new economic and well-being framework?
Thanks, Dimitri. Before I go there, I have to pull back and ask, and it's a question to all of us, why are we trying to save capitalism? I find that a really weird thing that we're talking about. I mean, let's just recognize we're on a planet that we are in the process of destroying its life support systems. We are killing our planetary home. And there are billions of people worldwide who have never been able to even access markets. They don't have the means to participate in markets, and their rights have never been met. So surely putting that at the center of our attention has to be what we're here for. I'm genuinely interested. I really enjoyed Frank's presentation of different kinds of capitalism, but why are we trying to save capitalism? Are we trying to create an economic system that's actually fit for the 21st century realities that we face? And I would just like to be propositional here. What I do want to, I don't want to save, I want to take from the 6 M's that I shared, that I believe together create the many different kinds of capitalism. Markets. I do believe that the market as a form of economic organizing is a very powerful one. Adam Smith was definitely onto something when he recognized the power of the market. He also massively recognized the limitation of the market. So I'm going to hold up this diagram that I call the embedded economy. Thanks to Herman Daly, we recognize the economy is a fully owned subsidiary of the living world. It's a social construct. But here inside the economy, look, we've got the market and we've got the state. And that's what much of our conversation so far has been about, the recognition of the possibility of both of these provisioning for our essential needs and wants, and the risks and limitations and the political dangers of capture. Let's never forget the household, the space of unpaid caring work that goes on every day and that indeed subsidizes and is the reproductive work behind the paid work of the market, and the commons. Elinor Ostrom recognized that the commons could be a triumph. And I think the 21st digital commons has an untapped potential. So if we're talking about new economic forms, I really want to make sure that the commons are a very important part of what we're considering. Otherwise, we're caught in this 20th century ideological boxing match between the market and the state. It's far too limited for what's possible. Now, I want to come into this space of market. I personally wouldn't want to live in a society that didn't have the market, that provision for everything we want, either through households or the commons or the state. I can't envision that working. So I'm for keeping the market, but really transforming the design of market actors. And this is coming to the point, I think, that was just raised about really looking at our institutions. So one more comment I want to bring here, the design of market actors. What kind of enterprises are actually going to be fit in the 21st century? My last cardboard cutout for the day. We need companies that are designed to help bring us into the donut. And that means they need to have a purpose that is in service of life. They need to network with their employees, their suppliers, their customers, their industry partners in ways that actually are progressive and recognize collaboration and not just that motivation of competition. But they need to be governed in ways that actually reflect the values that we're seeking. Who's in the room? Who has decision making? What are the metrics of success? The further deeper we go, the more powerful it gets. How are they owned? Why not reunite the means of production with the workers? Cooperatives, employee-owned companies, or steward-owned companies where Earth is one of the owners and has a voice, and finance. And now I'm ending up at the bottom, and this is the deepest. How do we stop finance being in service to accumulating an endless return to capital and turn finance into something that's actually in service of life? So for me, these are the deep design traits we need to work on for the future market actors in an economy that works. Now, the big question I would then invite, is it capitalism? I don't really care what we're calling it anymore, but I want to transform the systems, and I'm definitely not here to save capitalism.
So let's talk about markets and not capitalism. So I think I will then address the same question to Timothée, because certainly Kate, with her lively presentations, can muster the public support for this frugality, self-sufficiency, and degrowth. But do you think there is a way in which this is really possible in the future, assuming markets and not capitalism?
Yeah, no, I think there's all the obstacles to get to there are just institutional, political. So if there is a political will, there will be a way. And that, I think, what makes this much more realistic than the opposite, because the continuation of economic growth, there's not only need for a will, there's need for resources that don't exist. So that's the problem. At some point, you're going to hit a wall, and that wall is called the laws of thermodynamics. And that wall is going to be very difficult to overtake. And I don't believe in innovation, but I do believe in science. And you know what? We're not just trying to get to green growth and green capitalism. We've been trying this for a decade. The green economy at the start of the 2000s, and now we've had like 10, 15 years of actively trying to pursue green growth. And what we've managed to do is almost nothing. So now we're at the COP27, and we're discussing what has to be done in the next 5 years. So if I take a country like France that needs to divide its material footprint by 3 right now, not even a deadline, should have never, overtook that limit, and needs to divide its average carbon footprint by 5. On the other hand, it has managed since 1995 to reduce its carbon footprint by 9% through innovation and technological progress. So for me, assuming that we're going to go from 9% in almost 30 years to dividing it by 5 in 5 years, it's absolute madness. And even people that look at this, innovation is not just a word. You can look at patent, there's patent analysis. If you look at patent within the European Union, and we have a database for this, you see that eco-innovation have never been more than 15% of all patent, and that number has remained stable. So far we do have a lot of innovation, but that innovation is being channeled in more extractivism, in modes of productions that manage to do away with the saving labor, with inventing new products and new methods of exploiting resources that are actually deepening the problem. So I find here Kate's story is very appealing.
Absolutely.
And one of its fact that is appealing, that is just biophysically possible, on top of being socially desirable.
Thanks, Timothy. No, I mean, indeed. I mean, it's a complex issue. And actually, Frank, I would like to turn to you for a last question. I count on your diplomatic skills and on your brevity. Can we find a compromise between these views? Because is it really institutional constraints that split growers and slowers, I would say? Or is it about the concept of value, which actually Timothy mentioned earlier on, about the fact that we use, for instance, GDP as the main metrics, and we assume this perfect correlation with well-being? 1 minute.
1 minute. First, we are witnessing a reinvention of social market economy. No more, no less. What Kate was showing us is a kind of recreation of something that was discussed in the 50s after the disaster of the first part of the 20th century, where we saw that imperialist capitalism, closed market, imperial market was not working and led to war, destruction, massive loss of physical capital. And the people at the time, without the pressure of the ecological ceiling, reinvented a social market economy, which has many of the dimensions that was discussed there. And together they invented an ideology that we are having the legacy of here in the institution, which is the community spirit. That we are not only a group of individuals looking for profit, but we are bound together by a community spirit. Individual, states, citizen, grouping of society, commons. So there is, in what I saw from Kate, in a different context, maybe much more stressful even than the one of the 50s, the same way of recreating a kind of new shape of market economy where the market is present, but is not the only thing. And by the way, we were not in the business of saving capitalism. We were just saying that capitalism is extremely good at saving itself all the time. And this is why for everyone that think we will get rid of capitalism, just because we would wish to get rid of it, just good luck. Just read Althusser, our French philosopher, how deeply rooted in the very way we define ourselves capitalism is. It's not surviving just because you have the repressive apparatus of the state. It's not surviving only because companies are very convincing, but because the whole ideological structure, the very way we define ourselves, since we have been trained at school, is an ideology that kind of supports capitalism.
Merci, Frank. I knew that I could count on your capacity, actually, to strike a balance. Actually, we are a little bit late because the debate has been extremely interesting, I'm sure. So it's time, actually, to wrap up and say thank you to our distinguished guests. So let's give them hands. Thank you very much. I hope, I'm sure, that this has been an extremely enlightening debate, whichever way you may come out on the question about the future of markets, now we'll use the right term, Kate, or global welfare, wherever you position yourself in this continuum of thought between growers and slowers, supporters of markets or frugality, believers in green innovation, or believers in a new era of global accountability. So thank you very much to all. I'm very happy to close this session with this positive note, and actually looking forward to the next session of the day, where we will be discussing the future of the EU, of strategic foresight, and of the role of ESPAS, with a series of quite distinguished senior ESPAS members, including Klaus Welle, Secretary General of the European Parliament, Stephen Quest, Director General of the JRC and ESPAS Chair, and many others. So stay with us and have a good afternoon. Thank you.